How's it going, y'all? This is Nate Drolet, and welcome to part one of a 5-part series. In this series, I'm gonna walk through for each of those 4 groups beginner, intermediate, advanced, elite what I believe are the best methods, maybe just better than most methods, hard to say best, for long term improvement. In this first video, I'm going to break down each of the 4 categories, kind of what they are, who's inside of them, and the general philosophy around them. In the 4 subsequent videos, I will be breaking down each category in more detail. Now, this will include tools, tactics, techniques, and ways of thinking that people can use to continue to improve within those categories. And in a way, it's kind of a checklist. They can go through and say, okay, here are the things I have done, here are the things I haven't done. And regardless of whatever category you might be in currently, I highly recommend look above you, look below you, see what else you can learn. I've worked with beginner climbers who can really understand high level concepts very early on, even though they don't have a lot of the skills for rock climbing yet. Like the physical skills, they may have a lot of those mental skills, and knowing how to apply that by looking at advanced and elite skills and tool sets, I think is incredibly important. And on the other hand, I have worked with plenty of high level climbers who very much lack low level skills. And you can kind of budge your way into higher grades for a certain amount of time, lacking a lot of basic skills. But at a certain point, it's going to catch up with you, and it's really going to just be an anchor that holds you back. Before I dive in, there are a few caveats that I think that are important to cover. First, I believe that climbing is a game of mastery. I've been climbing 18 years. I still want to be climbing 18 years from now, and I want to be much better than I am now. Everything that I'll be talking about has this same concept of playing the long game. That might not fit with everyone's wants and needs, and so if you disagree with some of the things I'm saying based on timeline, that's okay. We all get to enjoy climbing in whatever aspect that we want. Now, this is the way I enjoy it in this long-term view, but if you don't, take what you can from this, but don't feel like these are hard and fast rules that you have to stick to. If you just say, hey, climbing's fun, I might not be doing it 2 years from now, I just want to be a little bit better today, cool. Take the approach that feels best to you. The next caveat that I have for my philosophy, and really the foundation of it, is this idea of the best are better at the basics. It's true in all sports, and I think it's especially true in climbing. So as I go through all of these hierarchies of beginner, intermediate, advanced, elite, I would say no matter what grade you climb, how long you've been climbing, I believe that all of these levels are important. And especially if you're higher leveled, pay attention to the easier things. I have worked with 513 climbers who are truly intermediate level climbers in the sense that that is where their skills are at. Maybe they were super gifted athletically, mentally they're really talented, they might just have a lot of time on their hands, and so they've been able to get a tremendous amount of consistency in. But we still have to take a step back and say, okay, you are missing intermediate level skills that are going to slow you down in the future. And maybe they're slowing you down now. My final caveat for all of the information in this 5-part series is that it's not perfect. These are things that I've worked on for a very long time to develop, and I like to think that I've thought these things out well, which is why I'm sharing them. But without question, I will be changing my mind. I will be updating things. This is not the end all be all. While I plan on covering a lot of information, I'm sure there will be plenty more in the future that will be added on into this. So if there's anything here that you say, ooh, this is important, but it wasn't covered, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think is really important that maybe I haven't covered. I would love to consider that, to take that in and think, hey, like, am I missing this? Is this something that I could be doing better? Like, should I update my way of thinking? For the first category, we're going to talk about beginners. Beginner climbers are people who've been climbing anywhere from day one up to 6 months to maybe 2 years. There's probably more variance in what defines a beginner climber than any other category. A lot of this is because of the amount of consistency someone has, how much intention they bring to climbing, just how stoked they are. Like, some people, whenever they get into climbing, they just want to absorb everything around them. All they do is watch climbing videos and talk with people about climbing. It's very much, okay, this is my personality now. I am now a climber. Those people who become obsessive might end up getting out of the beginner category a little bit faster than people who show up and they are consistent, but when they leave the gym, climbing isn't the main thing on their mind. Another reason why the beginner category is so broad is athleticism you bring to climbing, like what your background is, and especially what kind of sport you played, can have a huge role. I worked with someone who was a golfer. His mental game and his understanding of repetition and trying to really perfect things made him absolutely skyrocket through the grades. And within 2 years, he had climbed V12. That's pretty good. There are plenty of other sports that might contribute well, some contribute a little bit worse. It really just depends. No matter what, you can take your old experience and really apply it to climbing, which is really cool and I think absolutely fascinating. I love talking with people who've done different sports and to hear how that contributes to what they do now. I'm really hesitant to put a grade around what defines you as a beginner. Obviously, it starts at V0. It's just the bottom. But however much athleticism you bring into climbing can really affect how hard you climb within your first year. For example, I was back home in Texas and I took a buddy climbing who was a bull rider. In his first session, he climbed V5. He had a tremendous amount of hand strength, good awareness of how his body moved through space. He's just stubborn. He has a big ego and really had a lot to prove. So he just really wanted to climb hard the first time he went, and it was impressive. Now, does that make him not a beginner climber? No, he was terrible. Like, if anything, him being so strong made him worse than most beginner climbers. I mean, refused to put his feet on for anything if he didn't have to. If we want long-term development for a person like that, starting with the basics and really diving deep on those are what's going to allow them to continue to get better 5, 10, 15 years into climbing. If I had to use one word to describe the philosophy around improving as a beginner climber, I would say breadth. For beginners, being able to absorb as much as you can from every corner of climbing is such an important way to improve. There's so much, everything from understanding all the terminology, getting used to all the angles, all these different things. The more you can absorb in those first 6 months to 2 years of climbing, the better. For beginner climbers, I've got a handful of things that I think are very important. The first one I would say is developing basic coordination for most types of climbing. They should be able to climb on slab, vertical, overhang, roof, arêtes, dihedrals, all sorts of wall angles and shapes somewhat comfortably. They don't need to be proficient at these things, but it shouldn't be completely foreign to them. It's the same thing if we look at fundamental skills, techniques, drop knee, twisting in general, climbing square, heel hooks, toe hooks, being able to toe in, kind of just being able to use their body in space on the wall and having that be kind of comfortable. They don't need to be great at any of these things yet, but if a problem that they encounter has a heel hook on it, they should kind of know what that means. Like, okay, I'm going to put my heel behind it and like kind of pull with my leg. It doesn't need to be much more advanced than that, but I do think that having a good enough understanding of as many techniques as possible is much more valuable than any real deep dive on one or two specific techniques. The next thing that's important for beginners is being comfortable falling. This can be on boulders or routes, but it's not enough to just be comfortable on the wall. We have to be comfortable coming off of it too. People have joked forever that climbing is 99% falling. And there's a lot of truth to that. The more comfortable you can get with falling as a beginner, the better off you're going to be. I think starting low to the ground, especially with things like traverses, so that there's a very low risk when you do fall, great place to go. Man, practice falling a foot off the ground. Practice 2 feet off the ground. Get 2 feet off the ground, kind of swing back and forth and practice landing with some sideways speed, some backward speed, all these different things. Being comfortable coming off of the wall, knowing how to land, knowing how to orient yourself, that's going to allow you to spend more of your mental energy focusing on what you're actually doing while climbing, as well as it just takes some of the fear out. Like, it gives you a little more feeling of control over your climbing if you're not terrified of falling or even just hesitant around falling. The next skill that I think most beginners would really benefit from is basic memory for beta. Can you go up the wall, and when you come down, how much can you remember? Which handholds did you use? Which footholds did you use? If you can do that, you're in pretty good shape. And that may sound silly, but it's really helpful, and it's something that if you don't take the time to really develop on your own, it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. If you want to work on skills, if you want to send harder, being able to remember what you tried on your last go is critical if you want to be able to do better on your next go. Working on your memory, and this can be as simple as every time you go up a climb, come down, try and remember what your sequence was. Like, what were your lefts, what were your rights, what feet did you use for each go? To take it a next level, watch other people and try and remember what they do too. That, I think, is a little more of an advanced skill and something that comes along later, but the more you can practice your memory, the better off you'll be. On top of being comfortable with all different types of holds, techniques, and wall angles, it's really important to be able to communicate about these things. Do you know the names for everything? And that may seem silly, but there are so many words in climbing, and a lot of them are goofy. And a lot of things, there's like 4 or 5 different words for a single action. So being able to communicate with people is super helpful. The more that you can learn about how climbers talk and how to communicate with people, the faster you'll get better, because you can now talk with people and share lessons. Like, if someone's like, oh, I did this specific type of thing and it felt this kind of way, being able to hear exactly the words they use and understand them and to be able to translate it is incredible, because you can learn lessons from other people. Y'all, we don't have to only learn from making our own mistakes. Like, we can watch other people make mistakes, listen to them, and learn from it. And if you can do that, you're just going to keep getting better nonstop. As far as grip strength goes for beginners, I think that just becoming comfortable on most types of holds, comfortable being a loose term, we're talking about slopers here, being comfortable on most types of holds is going to take you a long way. As long as you're not avoiding specific things, you're going to continue to improve. Your hands are going to get stronger. If you're showing up consistently, you're trying hard, and you're on a mix of grip types, that's going to check a lot of boxes. The place I see a lot of beginners really get in trouble is that they want to skip things. Maybe they feel better on steep jugs or vertical crimps or things like that. Climb on everything. Climb on slopers, pockets, pinches, crimps. Every hold type that you can find, climb on it. Beyond just talking with other climbers, as a beginner, watch other climbers. Watch people with different body sizes, body types, with different strengths. Watch people who are really powerful. Watch climbers who are super graceful. Pay attention to how really flexible climbers move. There are so many amazing lessons that you can learn from watching everyone. It's a really easy trap to fall into, to see people who climb harder than you and just assume it's strength. Like, they're just stronger. And that's probably true. They are stronger, and you'll get stronger with time as well. But there is so much skill that goes into climbing well. As a beginner, if you can tell yourself more often than not, okay, this is a skill deficit that is holding me back, While that may not always be perfectly true, there's absolutely going to be times where your strength is holding you back. Calling it a skill deficit is going to end up being true more often than it's not. So watch other climbers, look how they move. Can you replicate it? How much can you really learn and take away from those other people? Try and mimic it. How does it feel? It probably feels hard and challenging and different. You haven't been climbing that long, so everything feels hard and challenging and different. And that's really important. That's one of the biggest takeaways you can have as a beginning climber, is just accepting that things are hard. This is all challenging. Being on an overhanging wall is not a natural position that we're used to, regardless of what other sports you've played. It's strange and it's funny, and it's going to take time to get comfortable with. Put in the hours and embrace the fact that it being challenging means that you're putting in the work where you need to get better. The next category is intermediate climbers. These climbers have been climbing for beyond their beginning years, up to 3 to maybe 5 years. Once again, this really depends on consistency and how intentional you are with your climbing. But I would say 5 years for an intermediate climber is not uncommon at all. That's pretty normal. Some people may never graduate beyond intermediate levels. This is totally fine. If climbing is just a fun thing that you're like, hey, I show up, it's a fun exercise, I like doing it, but I have a lot of other things in my life. I don't need to like nerd out and be hyper obsessive over it. That's cool. You can be in this category and you can go climb so many fun things for your entire life and it'll be a great time. If you're in the intermediate category, your job is now depth, where the beginners were breadth. For the beginners, it was let's learn absolutely everything there is out there on just a very surface level, where with intermediates, we need to start adding some depth to all this. Yes, you know what a heel hook is, and you can kind of use it, you can throw it out there. Let's start actually getting good at these things. As an intermediate, you really need to be intentional with what you do. We can no longer just show up, climb on all the different walls, and expect exponential growth the way that you do as a beginner. We really have to start paying attention to what we're doing more than ever. As a beginner, a big goal was becoming comfortable on the wall, both being on the wall as well as falling off of it. Now as an intermediate, because you've developed that base level of comfort, a lot of easy climbing is now kind of an unconscious thing. It can just happen on autopilot for you. Now that all this lower level climbing is on autopilot, we've freed up a little bit of space in our mind to where we can start focusing on things. And that's really cool. That's where a lot of like higher level technique really starts to trickle into rock climbing, is in this intermediate stage. Now that we're a little comfortable, it's no longer enough to just say, okay, I'm going to learn about everything. It's like, okay, I'm comfortable. I can be on the wall. Let's really play around with toe hooks. How do they work? Like, let's try a bunch of different ones. Let's try and get a good understanding of how do I do this? How does this technique work? Same thing with drop knees, with heel hooks, high steps, keeping your feet low. You should really try and understand these things a little bit better. Another thing that's important for intermediate climbers is getting comfortable in a lot of different body shapes. As a beginner climber, we really like, staying vertical. In general, as humans, we like just being vertical. So whenever you start to tilt sideways, lean backwards, have your feet above your head, being in these really disorienting shapes, that is hard and it's new and it's challenging, and sometimes it just feels wrong, even if it is the most effective way to do a rock climb. As an intermediate, getting used to climbing horizontally, twisting, being upside down, just being in a lot of different shapes that feel unnatural, and they tend to feel unnatural just because we haven't done them. Spend the time in these shapes and suddenly those will start to feel good for you. One of the most important things you can do as an intermediate climber is work on underdeveloped skills. I'm of the belief that as an intermediate climber, we don't really have weaknesses. For the most part, you just don't have a lot of experience doing something yet. If slopers are really hard for you, but you feel great on crimps, it's worth asking yourself, how much time do you spend on crimps and how much time do you spend on slopers? If you spend all of your time on crimpy faces and you avoid slopers at all costs, slopers, they may not be a weakness, you just literally haven't done them. Now, physical weaknesses obviously do exist. It's a very real thing, but there's so much to be gained from skill development that in this early stage in rock climbing, in your first couple of years, getting better just from the skill work will outshine the weaknesses that you have from having not done them. Not to mention, if you want to get stronger on slopers, climbing on slopers is a great way to do it. And especially if you're really weak at something, just doing the thing's immediately going to get you quite strong at it in comparison to where you were. Really hunt down the things that you have been avoiding. If there was a secret to getting better as an intermediate climber, that's it. Just do the things you've been skipping. You win. That's it. The rest of this, skip it. Don't skip it. I need it for the algorithm. But that really goes a long, long way. Just a little earlier, I talked about how, as a beginner, your goal was to get comfortable on the wall, both on and falling off. And now that you're an intermediate climber, just being on the wall, existing in that space, is comfortable. You can kind of be on autopilot. With that in mind, intermediate climbers need to start learning how to use cues when they climb. This could be, I'm going to really drive through this one leg as I do this move, or I'm going to hold my breath to keep tight as I do this tension move. As a brand new beginner climber, it's very challenging to add cues into the mix. You can do some, but just existing on the wall is very overwhelming in a lot of ways. Once that is no longer a thing, you can suddenly start adding in more and more layers to the way you climb. So you can say, oh, I'm going to really focus on tall posture and pulling in a certain way. Being able to incorporate these cues, amazing. It can really change your problem solving style. It suddenly goes from, I have specific beta for hands and feet, to you have this internal focus beta of, I have my hands and feet, but also I need to focus on what I'm doing with this limb or this set of limbs. When you start doing that, cool things really start to happen. Next is being able to visualize how your body exists in space on the wall. Simplest way to put this, I like to refer to it as a sphere of influence. And it's essentially, if you just think about yourself starfished out, how far do your hands reach? How far do your legs reach? How high can you high step? When you pull, how low does your arm go? Things like that. Basically, if you're on the wall, what can you actually do? The more you can understand that, the better. If you can look on the wall and say, okay, I know I can keep my foot there and reach up to here. That's going to be at my max, but I can reach it. That's pretty awesome. Being able to be on the wall, look around and know what is and isn't within your reach. And same thing with feet. How high can you use and how low can you use? These are all really necessary things. Once again, there are much higher level skills to this. This is a very core concept that you really want to develop. Another issue that I think is really crucial for all climbers, and it ends up coming up right around the intermediate, maybe advanced stage, is this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And essentially it's our confidence in what we know vastly outweighs how much we actually know. As a beginner, God, we're just bumbling around. Everything is new. We don't know anything. All the words are weird. And you get to a certain point where you're like, oh no, I think I got it. I think I know what's going on now. I've been doing this climbing thing for 2-3 years. I think I know what's up. And it's at that point that it can be really hard to learn new lessons. If you're convinced you know how everything works, this is the time where so many people will say, well, yeah, I'm a really well-rounded climber. I just have to get stronger and fitter at this point. If I just get my hands stronger, if I just, get better endurance, I'm gonna climb harder. Cause I've got the skills. I'm not bad at climbing. And while you're not bad at climbing at this point, man, there's so much to learn. There's so much to develop. And this is a stage all of us go through where we hit this level of kind of feeling comfortable being competent at something. It's nice to feel competent at things, but don't allow yourself to sit there too long. Remind yourself, okay, there's a ton to learn. Go climb with people who are better than you. You'll immediately be like, oh wait, never mind. No, I don't know anything. And this is something I feel all the time. I've been climbing 18 years. I climb with people who are better than me as much as I can. And every time I do, I'm like, yeah, no, there's still so much for me to learn and get better at in this sport. It's going to take a lifetime. Getting over that hurdle, learning how to appreciate that of just, you know what, there's endless ways to get better at this, and I have a lot to learn. The faster you can get into that mindset, the faster you can skip any plateaus that you might end up getting stuck on by being convinced you already have all the answers. The very last thing is the idea of embracing difficulty. As a beginning climber, progress comes quickly. It comes often because there's so many different things to learn from and get better at that you just kind of keep getting better. As an intermediate, you don't get wins every day anymore. Probably not. It takes more work for everything. Like, you have to seek it out a little bit more. And this only gets harder. The more advanced you get and the longer you've been climbing, the harder it is to find these little spaces where you can get better at. So learn how to do that early. That's super crucial, and it can become really fun. It gets really enjoyable to learn how to embrace difficulty and say, oh, this is hard for me. Awesome. That's going to make me better. The sooner you can really learn how to cultivate that mindset, the better off you're going to be. Next, we're going to talk about the advanced category. Now, these people are climbers who've been climbing consistently and with a pretty high degree of focus for the last 5+ years. Might take 5 years, might take 10, hard saying. If I was to describe the advanced category and their needs in one word, it would be focused. With beginners, the goal was breadth. Gather and learn everything you can. With intermediates, it was depth. So we've gathered a ton of information. Let's start to understand it a little bit. With advanced, we need to start being a little more selective and a little more focused on what it is that we're actually paying attention to and working on. It's no longer enough to show up, climb, and just sort of go by what feels hard. We need to be a little more thoughtful about what we're doing and say, okay, these are the things that I'm consistently struggling on. I need to work on them from multiple perspectives and not just say, I'm bad at slopers, let's climb on slopers. There are a multitude of things that advanced climbers should work on as well as keep in mind throughout this period of their climbing career. First off, trusting the process. Progress is going to be the slowest at this point that it's ever been in your climbing career. And that's kind of how climbing works. It's how almost everything works. As you're a beginner, skyrocket. You get better every day. Intermediate, still good. You find these like pockets that you haven't discovered at all before. And when you try that, you're like, oh, maybe I should climb on more vert crimps to get better at vert crimps. Amazing. You get way better at vert crimps. As an advanced climber, a lot of these low-hanging fruit have been kind of picked. So it's not as often that we're going to have these just massive breakthroughs at this point. So you need to trust the process. Progress comes in months and years rather than weeks at this stage. So be patient and understand that it's just going to take a while. It's at this point that a lot of people believe that they have plateaued in climbing, when in reality, they just need to be more patient with the things they're working on. If you've already got decent hand strength and you're like, oh, I want to get stronger at crimps, it's going to take a while. And you just have to trust the process, really take your time, and know that you might not see progress for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But when you do, that progress is really meaningful because you've already started at a high base. If you see progress as a beginner climber, a lot of times it just means you showed up. And that's not to say anything against beginner climbers. That's one of the cool things. You just get better all the time. But as an advanced climber, we just have to put in the hours. Along those same lines, right now as an advanced climber, you're the most susceptible to buying into magic bullets and quick fixes. It's very tempting to see this shiny thing. Right now it's very popular that is some sort of strength training, probably even finger training, and you see it and you're like, oh, this could fix me. This one thing can take care of all my problems. Chances are it's not going to. Could it help? Maybe. Yeah, sure. But If you think a single thing is going to revolutionize your climbing, at this stage, it's probably just not. I hate to say it. I wish it was true. And if it was true, I would be using it and I'd be telling you to use it. But there's nothing I've seen currently that is convincing enough to say, don't look at the 4 pillars of sports performance, which are mental, physical, technical, and tactical, and try and maximize all of them, and instead go for this one singular thing. It just hasn't appeared yet. And you know what? I think there's a lot of people who've been climbing for a long time and a lot of smart people who've looked for these things. And the fact that nothing's shown up yet has me believing that we need a more all-encompassing and holistic approach to improving and climbing versus just trying to find these 1 or 2 little quick fixes. Another thing that's important for advanced climbers is to make the skills you've developed as an intermediate climber unconscious or automatic. These are the types of things where maybe you had to really focus on them as an intermediate climber, 2-3 years in, but now it should be something that you don't have to think about in the slightest. The reason this is so important is that as we get better, we have to be able to layer on more and more skills and techniques into our climbing. If the lower level skills aren't automatic, if they aren't just mindless for us to be able to perform, we can't layer more skills on top of it. We can only focus on so many things at once and still be able to perform. If you try and walk and pay attention to every little detail it is about how you walk, like how do you heel strike? What part of your foot are you weighting? Like how far is your gait? Suddenly you're just going to start stumbling around. It's really hard to really pay attention to a ton of little details all at once. While there are quite a few ways to be able to make skills feel automatic and happen without you having to really be hyper-focused on them, one method that's really important and I think starts to come into play for advanced climbers is this concept of chunking. And so that is, how do we combine a lot of different inputs for a singular move into one single cue that we can kind of pull on? As we get more advanced, a single move can have a lot of different inputs that we need to give. So it might be, I'm going to have my right foot pointed in, really put a lot of pressure, keep the heel like level to the ground because I can't rise or lift the foot. The left foot needs to be out, creating counter pressure, squeezing against the wall. It needs to be at a certain height. Maybe I really need to have a tall chest and like good tall posture. When I'm rowing, I need to be pulling a certain way. All of these different things. When I go to a hold, I need to go to it as if my feet aren't going to cut, knowing I still also have to know that my feet are going to cut because of the difficulty of this move and the way the feet are. So I need to not be surprised by that. These are all these different little inputs that are really challenging in their own ways. And if we can't take all of those that are all necessary and combine them together into one feeling, one sensation, or maybe even 2 different ones. So I could say I have this initial setup sensation of this is the chunk. This is how my body should feel. And I can replicate this feeling. And then when I go into a move, there's this second feeling that I'm replicating, the second chunk. We can only focus really on one thing at a time whenever we're climbing. If you try and have multiple focuses, you'll fall apart. So being able to take these groupings of skills and bring them in to feel like a singular item that we can put our mind's focus onto, massively important. The next thing I think that is important for advanced climbers is to have a more detailed understanding of how your body takes up space on the wall. With intermediates, I talked about this idea of a sphere of influence. Statically, how far can you reach with your arms and your legs, and kind of how high can you get your feet? Things like that. We want to take this and apply movement to it. It's no longer just how far can I reach. It's, okay, if I'm on underclings, how high can I go off of those? Like knowing that there's a certain amount of force I'm going to have to create. If I'm doing, like, how far can I lock off? If I have a really high foot, how dynamic can I be off of it? So we're trying to combine not only just the knowledge of how large our body is and how much space it can take up, but what kind of movement can we apply to be able to get the most out of our body's size? Adding on to that, it's helpful at this point to develop some basic understanding of anatomy. Now, this doesn't have to be anything crazy. Some things are pretty simple and easy to apply. A good example of this is our toes and our knees generally like to move in the same direction. If you think about if you're going to go for a run, they're kind of both going to be tracking along with each other, your knees and your toes. The same thing can be said for rock climbing. If I'm going to do a drop knee, it's nice if my knee's going to go this way. My knee generally likes if my toes are going that way too. If my toes are pointing forward and my knees going this way, it can work because we do have some range of motion in our ankles side to side, but it's not going to be as powerful. It's not going to give you as much like tension and strength, and it's going to limit the amount of range you have. There's quite a few examples of this, of how basic anatomy and physiology can be leveraged to understanding rock climbing just a little bit better. Doesn't need to be anything crazy. You don't need a textbook for this. A few basic concepts can really help level up your climbing. As an advanced climber, you should be doing your best to get rid of any glaring weaknesses. As a beginner, nothing's a weakness. Like everything's a weakness. As an intermediate, a lot of your weaknesses are mostly just tied to having not spent enough time doing something. Now, as an advanced climber, once you hit a certain level, there are going to be things that you struggle with, not just because you haven't done enough of it. You're actually going to have to be a little bit intentional and focused and really think about, if you're bad at power moves, we need to think about this. Physically, what can you improve? Mentally, do you just want to feel in control all the time? Do you enjoy feeling in control and smooth? Does that feel like what good technique is to you? Maybe that's more of a mental hang up than a physical. And this is something I see all the time. Technically, let's look at how do you generate momentum? How are you sticking holds? You might be plenty strong and you might have all the confidence in the world, but if you're messing up your technique on how to be powerful, it's still going to really hold you back. And then there are tactics. There are certain things that can be helpful. Honestly, wearing soft shoes makes most people feel more powerful. If you're wearing stiff shoes, it makes you climb kind of stiff and rigid. Versus softer shoes, you end up being a little more fluid feeling. There are a lot of different tactics that can come into play. As an advanced climber, anytime we have a weakness, we really need to focus on it. We need to look at it from all angles. I will say that I have never met a V10 climber who doesn't have glaring weaknesses. That's something that you should aim to fix, no matter what level you're at. It doesn't even matter what your goals are to some degree. Let's say you just like doing sloper climbs with big moves, pinches, compression, things like that. And you say, I don't need to grab crimps. They're mean. They hurt my feelings. They're kind of painful. I don't want to do it. The problem is, as you become more and more advanced, sloper problems are going to have crimps on them. It might only be the start holds. It might be one hold in the middle of it, but it's really rare to find a very pure example of a single style. Same thing, you might like technical crimping. There might be some easy power moves on it that if you struggle with power climbing, you can't even show all of this strength and skill you've developed in your niche style. As an advanced climber, there shouldn't be any big glaring weaknesses in the way that you climb. The last thing that I'll say for advanced climbers is that now is a good time to start considering adding strength training or just some sort of regular training into your climbing routine. As a beginner and intermediate climber, we don't need to worry about this quite as much. If you want to, do it. It's great. It's fun. Strength training helps just make you more robust. And that's great. We all like that. Injuries are terrible. But I think that most of your strength should be coming from climbing. Anything beyond that is supplemental. The issue comes up with, as we become advanced, we get better at rock climbing. Getting better at rock climbing means becoming more efficient and having better strategies for how we approach climbing. It's kind of ironic, but the better you get at climbing, the worse of a strength and fitness stimulus it becomes. As a beginner and intermediate climber, we're really inefficient. We just overpower everything with our arms and we try things way too many times. We have terrible tactics. We try everything from the ground. We don't rehearse moves. We're not as strategic. We don't know when to really take our time and dial things in versus when to try hard. So that's why beginners and intermediates just get so much stronger from just climbing is because their tactics are terrible and their approach is terrible and they're pretty inefficient. No offense if you're a beginner or intermediate climber, this is kind of a thing we all go through. And if you talk to someone who's been climbing 15 years, we've all had a very similar experience of you're a beginner, you're very weak because that's just, climbing's new and novel and these movements are novel. You get stronger and stronger. And typically, for a lot of people, they hit their first peak of strength as an intermediate climber, kind of towards the tail end. And then as they become more advanced, their strength actually trickles off a little bit if they don't train, though their performance continues to improve. And this is because of they learn better technique. They have better tactics. Their mindset's better. They're more confident in what they can do. All of these other things improve, but they actually kind of get a little bit weaker. And it's a funny thing, but it happens to a lot of us. Greatest example is probably pull-up strength. No one's going to do more pull-ups than someone who's been climbing like 3 years. That for a lot of people is like a peak in just being able to do massive amounts of pull-ups. A lot of it is because also we think that pull-ups, high quantity pull-ups are going to really help us at that time. But also you just over pull with your arms for everything early on in those first few years of climbing. So as an advanced climber, now that you move better, you weight your feet more, you're more strategic with your efforts, ironically, now is the time we have to really start adding in some supplemental strength training to make up for all of those strength and fitness benefits that we're losing by becoming better and more efficient climbers. Doesn't have to be much, just a little bit goes a long way. And if you've already been doing it, cool, that's awesome. But if you haven't done any sort of training up to this point, it's worth considering. The final category that I'm going to talk about today is elite climbers. Just to clarify, I would say there's probably a grouping beyond this, like the super elite, which would be, the top 0.1%, the people trying to put up the hardest climbs in the world. I feel like that is its own category. This falls below that for sure. That just requires something really different. And I'd like to remind you, these categories are more based on experience rather than purely grade. While there aren't going to be a lot of people who make it to the elite category in terms of experience, I think it's less so because of what they're capable of, but a lot of this is just a time thing. This is going to take 10, 15 plus years of very consistent and intentional work. And, we all love rock climbing, but not everyone loves it enough to do it with that much singular focus for that long. And that's okay. You can be an advanced climber, an intermediate climber, and still go do a ton of things, have a great time, and still find a lot of enjoyment out of improvement. But for the people who this is a lifelong pursuit of mastery for them, this, I think, is the end goal, to try and really refine things down to the highest level possible. You're going to hear me say this a bunch of times. The best are better at the basics. And I think that really encapsulates the idea of what elite climbers should be striving for. They should be trying to be great at just about everything. They don't need to be the world's best at every single individual thing, but it's no longer enough to just not have big weaknesses. For advanced climbers, hey, don't have such severe low-hanging fruits that it limits everything else. For elite climbers, you need to be pretty good at just about everything, within reason. I don't know, off with is okay, do a little bit of it. Maybe it's not the most important thing in the world, but like critical skills, you should be pretty good at for most of them. And this is something that you end up seeing from very elite climbers, is that even if they have one or two things that they say that they specialize in, they might say, oh, well, I'm really into crimping and I love like controlled crimp climbing. And they might say, oh, I'm terrible at slopers. Slopers moving dynamically, can't do it. But if you look at it, it's like they still get it. They're still pretty good at slopers and still pretty good at being dynamic. Now, is it as good as their super strength? No, it's not. But they don't really have, if you're an intermediate or advanced climber, you would trade anything to have these weaknesses of elite climbers. Typically, it's like, oh, that's what you're weak at? Must be nice. Like, if that's what your low hanging fruit level is. So, if you're an elite climber, or if you're trying to break into that elite experience category, now's the time to really look at what are the things that you're okay at, like it hasn't been a complete hindrance to you, but that you can still level up. Just like back with advanced, where progress is going to come more slowly over time, with elite climbers, that's even more so. So it's worth looking at, okay, this isn't a huge weakness, but it's something that could still be shored up, and that would improve my other abilities really well. Finding those things suddenly become more important. Much like with advanced climbers, elite climbers should be working towards making all of the skills that they've learned in the past more automatic, more unconscious. And we're just trying to add more and more layers of complexity as we go. And in order to do that, we need everything below us to happen it needs to be running in the background so that we can really just focus on the few things that matter. Along with that, elite climbers can really differentiate their abilities to perform well and perform quickly on hard climbs by knowing what small details to really focus on. Now, here comes a big issue. The longer you've been climbing, the more you learn. As we learn more and more, it can become really overwhelming to know what methods to use, what betas to try, what should we be really emphasizing every time we do a move. Because if you have 100 different ideas that you could be applying to this one movement, it would take forever to go through those individually. And this is where a skill set of the elite can really come in handy. As an elite climber, you should be aiming to develop your skill to look at a move and say, it's almost like a tier list. Here are the 5 things that I think should be most likely to work. I have seen them work in this type of situation before in my many years of climbing. So I'm going to try these first. Then I have the next tier. These are things that maybe have worked in somewhat similar situations, but not quite like this. I'm going to try those as well because, who knows? Also, there's going to be something else where you say, maybe this might be a thing here. I'm not really sure, but elite climbers also have to recognize that there's a lot of unique types of climbing, and they're not always going to have the answers. Trying a lot of different things and collecting data points becomes absolutely crucial. Another piece of the puzzle for elite climbers, or people trying to be in this category, is this advancement on understanding your body. So that same concept I've been talking about, sphere of influence. So this is no longer just how far you can reach and how far you can pull, but understanding the intersection of balance and strength and mobility. You need to be familiar with different positions and understand that at certain lengths of your body, if I'm reaching really far out, maybe this will allow me to be in a better position, but physically it's going to be more taxing. So it's good for balance, but maybe really more advanced and harder physically. You're going to run into these instances where you are having to make trade-offs between your mobility, your physical strength capabilities, and what ideal positions there are offered by the actual climb itself. And understanding how these kind of give and take situations work is absolutely crucial. At this point, you already know how far you can reach, how far you can high step. Now we need to know the give and take of all of these situations. It's at this point that there are less right and wrong answers, and there's a lot more nuance. You need to know how to wade through that. In order to do that, we need to understand all of the attributes that we have and how they work together. How do they influence each other? How do they take away from each other? Being able to understand that about your own body takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience and focus and intention, but it's something that's going to allow you to solve beta on your own more often and to be able to climb harder problems quicker. Elite climbers also now have to worry about losing skill. You've been climbing long enough that certain skills will detrain. We will lose that currency of, oh, I spent 2 years really focusing on this thing and then I haven't paid attention to it for a decade. that thing might not be that good anymore. And that's okay. It's much easier to relearn skills than it is to learn them the first time. But you suddenly are balancing so many more skills and attributes all at the same time. And we have to understand that some will drop as others improve. And that's just a part of trying to really squeeze out the last drop of every different attribute that we can. If you really want to maximize, whatever it is, steep crimping, you're going to have to deprioritize some other things for a little while because this is already so advanced that for you to make it better, you really have to make it a priority. And if this is prioritized, other things are going to suffer. Maybe not much, but a little bit. And understanding that is very important. At this point in climbing, it ends up being a trade-off more often than just being able to continue to add more and more and more in every direction. The very last thing that I want to talk about for elite climbers, or for people who want to become elite in this kind of experience level, I think this is the thing that ends up holding people back the most. And it's feeling like you already know everything, that you've got all the answers, you've got it figured out. It can be easy to feel stuck for a lot of people at this stage. You just have to be able to take a step back and acknowledge, okay, I don't know everything. There's still plenty of ways to grow and develop, and I just need to be open-minded. I've been climbing whatever it is, 10, 15 years, and maybe I have certain avenues that have worked well for me. I need to try and have a beginner's mind again. How can I see things with new eyes? What are the avenues that I can take to where I can still really grow without having to add more? And if you can do that as an elite climber, man, you're going to go pretty far. Thanks for watching part 1 of this series. From here, I'll be going through each of those categories and breaking down sort of a checklist. Things that, if you are within those categories, you can say, okay, here are the things that I should maybe try and aim for. And I would suggest look above, look below at different categories, because looking ahead is fun and there might be things that you can start working on now. And looking behind you is really important because maybe there were skills you missed. As I go through these next 4 videos, this is also something of a syllabus for what I plan on presenting with this channel. I hope that I can give you not just small tools and tactics and fun things to take away, but a greater methodology to be able to approach your climbing with. I hope you'll join me as I continue to share this methodology. I've got 4 more videos that dive into more detail than what I did today. And then from here, I'll really start getting into the nitty-gritty of each of those little checkboxes. Thanks for joining along.